What's going on, ladies and lads? It's Wednesday once again, and it's time for another movie review. Now, since the only thing of real interest that came out this week was Haunting in Connecticut 3, like I give a damn, I went ahead and watched Doctor Sleep, the sequel to The Shining. Now, to know a bit about me, you have to know that Kubrick is definitely one of my favorite directors, and The Shining is definitely one of my favorite movies, though I prefer 2001, honestly, in a visual perspective. However, I was extremely disappointed by Doctor Sleep, and I'm going to go into why. I felt like it really did not live up to the hype it put for itself, didn't even touch The Shining, and ultimately it just kind of failed in many ways. Though mild attempts were made to emulate the cinematographic eye of Kubrick, on the whole, Doctor Sleep is a hammy, dour, badly paced shell of a superhero film. That's right, Doctor Sleep is cape shit. And it's not even good cape shit. It's an established fact at this point that Stephen King was not a real fan of Kubrick's film, as Kubrick changed many things for his production, including the nature of The Shining and the ending in general. Unfortunately, Stephen King's inability to let go of 30 plus years of butthurt negatively affected this film, and it prevents it from ever reaching the highs of The Shining. In this video, I'm going to enumerate a few key points at which these two films differ, and I'll provide an explanation of why I believe one failed and one succeeded. I'll try to keep the criticism constructive, though personally I have to place the failure of this film on Stephen King's disdain for a near 40-year-old project, which, in my opinion, artfully strayed from the silliest parts of his ideas, and condensed it into a cinematic classic. And it also falls on the director's inability to say no to his childhood hero, though at this point, always say yes to Mr. King is probably written in his contracts. Fair warning, spoilers ahead if you have not seen this. I will hold nothing back. So we open with a young girl with a strange intuition walking in the forest alone, before she is beset by our main villain, Rose the Hat, and her gang of shining vampires known as the True Knot. From the beginning of this film, we are told that this is only partially Danny's story, because the focus is on other Shiners before Danny himself. This scene is also a foreshadowing of the numerous pacing problems that come throughout the movie, but I'll get into those later as we get deeper into the plot. Rose and the True Knot then capture the young girl, presumably to eat her, and we hit the opening credits. Now, the opening credits are where the first real member-berry moments occur. Danny is a young boy post-Shining, tortured by his visions of the ghosts of his past. They follow his Shining actively, hunting him no matter where he goes until his mentor, Halloran, gives him a box inside his mind into which to capture the spirits. Halloran tells Danny that nobody shines like him, but as we come to find out, Danny's entire purpose in this movie is going to be transferring his legacy to someone who undoubtedly shines better than him. The actress playing his mother does her best to impersonate Shelley Duvall and does a serviceable job, but it's near impossible to emulate Duvall's facial and physical mannerisms. The actress did her best and at the very least delivers that same warm yet distraught sense of care that Duvall had. Danny takes his box and begins capturing the ghosts that follow him, and we flash forward to Danny as a man. It has been 30 years since Danny first experienced the horror of the Overlook Hotel, and he has become a street urchin and low-life drug addict, living in a gutter and running away from his abilities. He drinks, he fights, he gets laid by single mothers. Truly, his is a blessed life. On one such occasion, he is faced with a pointless moral quandary when he decides to steal money from one of these women, and his mentor visits him like the ghost of Christmas past, telling him to leave the money, quote-unquote, at least. Danny walks away, and the camera doesn't really show us if he actually leaves the money. But it doesn't matter, as a future scene will show us that both her and the baby died anyway. And this is what I mean by pacing issues. The movie wastes 5 minutes right at the beginning on a pointless moral quandary that is only explored once in passing, just to give Danny a minor twinge of guilt. This also makes Danny's mentor look like a real dick, because he showed up just to speak in riddles instead of saying, "Yo, Danny, you know that hoe is dead, right?" We change scenes to a theater, and Rose the Hat is tailing a young Shiner who she believes could be an asset to her group. Their target is essentially a hypnotist, and she uses her powers to lure men to theaters and rob them. Now I have to mention, these men are pedophiles, for some inexplicable reason. Even though this character never displays a hint of being a good person or potentially having a change of heart, her initial crime required some sort of moral superiority. The only reason I can think for this scene to be written as such is that Stephen King, again, got really butthurt when people pointed out that he had an adolescent gangbang in his book version of it. And now he's got the typewriter going full force in defense mode, trying to prove he isn't a nonce by punishing them severely in his written works. Our young Shiner then carves on her Mark's face because Mr. King wants you to know so hard that he isn't a pedo, that he will disservice his own characterizations. Just like Corella from the recent film, this young Shiner probably could have been a good person if only the men in the world had let her. We are then introduced to the true main character of the film, Abra the young savant Shiner. Yes, the most powerful magician is named Abra, and yes, supposedly Stephen King stopped doing drugs. Though she does not have much control over her abilities to begin with, she is incredibly powerful already, regularly performing psychic feats that astound her parents. Consider that in The Shining, Danny was a simple boy who talked to himself. He could have plausibly had mental illness, which increases the actual drama of The Shining being real, and a not so wholly positive thing. While in this movie, Shining is portrayed like the Power Rangers, a myriad set of psychic and sometimes physical skills with various power levels. In fact, Abra's powers are so immense that her using them as a child alerts both Danny and Rose the Hat to her existence. Danny, following the trail that Abra left, moves to a small town in New Hampshire and meets a trusting man named Billy, played rather sincerely by Cliff Curtis, who becomes his good friend and AA sponsor. Billy offhandedly mentions that sometimes he has an intuition about people, a clear trace of The Shining that is not really developed past this point, much to the detriment of his character at the end of his arc. I personally like Cliff Curtis, and Philly could have used a bit more material here. This is where the pacing of the movie starts to affect the actual quality, and we're only 25 minutes in. Things like characterizing Billy are left to the wayside for future long takes of scenery, and pointless sympathy for the devil moments such as the theater. We move into Rose initiating the young Shiner from the theater into her group with the offer of eating well, staying young, and living long. It is revealed at this point that the True Knot actually feed off of Shine to extend their lives, and that they are all semi-immortal. Unfortunately, as cool of an idea as this sounds on paper, we never really get to see the breadth of it borne out, as they never talk about the histories of the various members of the Knot, except in passing, and though they are supposedly picked for having unique abilities, we never see them actively used. So in effect, the True Knot are nothing more than just a mob of tertiary characters at Rose's back. An extremely disappointing missed opportunity. However, Crow Daddy does have perhaps the best dialogue in the movie later on, successfully achieving a rare moment of classic King in this film. Danny wakes up that night, presumably having felt the ritual, and we have a bit of a spook in which the lady and her baby that Danny may or may not have taken money from appear in his bed, as ghosts. It would be a genuinely good moment if it was in another film. When I saw it, I just couldn't stop thinking about what a douche his mentor was for not telling Danny to call the police. Looking back, I'm suspicious about what his motives were. I think Halloran just wanted the money for himself. Danny begins working as a janitor in what I can only assume is an elderly home. Following a cat, he happens upon a dying man who explains that the cat has always been there and knows when it is someone's time. Danny guides this man through his passing and in doing so realizes his purpose. This is where he's given the moniker Dr. Sleep, though it's only used a few times in passing. Compared to some other parts at the back half of this movie, I found this to be a genuine, beautiful moment, and I have to give it to both the older gentleman and Ewan McGregor for making it work. Upon returning to his room, Danny is greeted by a message on his wall from Abra, a simple hello sent psychically, to which he responds hi. We flash forward 8 years, and Danny is now a sober, hardworking member of the community. He speaks about how he drank not only to drown the memories, but also to experience his father in the only way he knew him, through a bottle. I did like this bit. If anyone is really qualified to speak on the nature of addiction, anger, and dedication, it would be Stephen King. I know this review may be giving you the wrong idea, but I actually have a lot of respect for Stephen King. Then again, I have a lot of respect for a few people, Stanley Kubrick being among them. But above everything else, over the names and the themes and the archetypes, I respect the Kino most of all. Rejoining the True Knots, we find them in a state of starvation, and they espouse that finding Shiners has become much harder as time has passed. Crow Daddy posits that perhaps it is the soy in Netflix that has robbed the world of its shine, and on a philosophical level, I can't help but agree. Crow Daddy remarks that he may need some of the reserves to help find another victim, which later helps to illustrate the lack of variety in the True Knot's abilities, and the overwhelming power of Abra. After imbibing essence, Crow Daddy and the Shiner from the theater, who will now be referred to as the Temptress, kidnap a young child walking home after a Little League game. They take him to a secluded spot to feast, which sends Abra into night terrors as she feels him die. Rose the Hat has some edgy dialogue about pain purifying steam, which Abra later regurgitates to her during the final hero moment. The wall that Danny had been talking to Abra through cracks, and the word Red Rum appears, though I can think of no lore reason why Abra would say Red Rum. Just another haphazard stitching for the trailer so you can collect the nostalgia points, I suppose. Rose the Hat, having sensed Abra watching her during the murder, decides that she will be their next target. Abra goes to school the next day, and with a little internet sleuthing discovers who the baseball boy is, and astral projects to the scene of the murder, using nothing but a printed picture of his missing persons report. Her eyes even roll back in her head so you can visually understand how much more powerful she is than anyone else in this story. She deus exes her way into the location of the murder, a closed industrial site located somewhere in Iowa. She even goes a step further just to prove how powerful she is by using her window to find Rose the Hat personally, and this she does with absolutely no totem except the knowledge of Rose's face. Thus commences the scene which totally destroys any sense of drama or suspense this film may have had, in which an adolescent savant gains the upper hand on a centuries-old cold-blooded killer. For a moment, I was afraid we might actually have a classic King villain on our hands, but the director made certain that she never amounts to more than a discount caricature of a neutered Dracula. One could argue that the grocery store scene was only meant to display Abra's potential, but in doing so, she cut our villain's knees in a John Cena-style squash, and Rose never really recovers her sense of menace or danger after that. Rose decides that they will kill Abra instead of recruiting her, having seen her power, and Abra takes a bus to meet Danny. Turns out she had GPS in her head, and she doesn't even need an image of Danny to track him. Fuck me. This conversation seems concerned with building a lore around The Shining, something that was much better played in a subtle fashion in Kubrick stylings. It implies that many people have a minor amount of Shining, thereby making Shining overall less special, but making Abra herself more special for being so talented at it. Abra wants Danny to find the body of the baseball boy, since she obviously has no real fear of the True Knots. She is in the power position after all. Though the True Knots think they're hunting her, the hunt on them has already begun by the midpoint of this movie. The plan is to get the murder victim's baseball glove, since one of the group, hilariously named Barry the Chunk for unknown reasons, was wearing it while they fed. I guess you can't let a murder get in the way of a good game of catch. Now Danny, for some reason, is apprehensive about helping Abra. This is a constant theme in this movie, where everyone around Abra is less intelligent, less capable, and less willing than her in virtually every task. He returns to his job and has a conversation with Halloran in which he tells Danny to pay it forward and be better. He then departs what he calls the dream of reality, and Lord, if only I could wake up from this movie. That night, Rose the Hat goes on an astral search for Abra, which involves a full minute of flying through CGI dust and cloud matter. This is exactly what I mean by time wasted. She arrives in Abra's neighborhood because apparently all she needs to track Abra is having met her psychically. But wait, I thought Crow Daddy's thing was tracking. That's why he needed the bottled shine so he could find the baseball boy? Fuck it! Fuck it! Rose goes up to Abra's room, where Abra has laid a trap for her, and Abra enters her mind and starts rummaging through her memories. The visual presentation of their minds is reminiscent of another Stephen King film, Dreamcatcher, and it's perhaps the only enjoyable part of this scene. In fact, I think I enjoyed Dreamcatcher a lot more than Dr. Sleep. At this point, it became obvious that Abra was never going to be in any real consequential danger, and that the True Knot would be playing the role of jobbers. They're absolutely at Abra's mercy psychically, and this is probably why they decided not to really explore their individual histories or shining skills, much to my disappointment. Danny wakes up, and the script attempts to make it seem like Abra did wrong by provoking Rose, but we all know where this is going. To add insult to injury, Rose the Hat must immediately deal with the passing of the True Knot's oldest member, one who supposedly cheered the gladiators in Rome and fed on kings and princes and popes. Too bad we never saw this supposed badass do a single thing, except lightly cough. He dissolves into steam, and the True Knot feed on his ashes, so they can look pathetic as well as weak. Danny recruits Billy to go with him to find Baseball Boy, and this would be the perfect time for him to talk about intuition or something with Billy so that we can care about him when he, spoiler, is killed by the Temptress. Instead, Billy gets to play dumb deaf driver to Danny and Abra's astral conversation, remarking every so often with what I suspect were attempts at comedic relief. Danny and Billy eventually find Baseball Boy and return the glove to Abra, where she receives the approval of her father to hunt the True Knots down with extrajudicial prejudice. The dialogue implies that they have no worry of the law nor of money, but we really haven't seen any indication of that, as every scene involving the True Knots is just them rolling around in an RV gang like a bunch of hippies. Meanwhile, the True Knots load up to hunt Abra down, but decide to leave Rose the hat since Abra has been in her mind. Using the glove, Abra sees where they are once again, deflating any tension he may have felt about their impending arrival. The gang hatches a plan to ambush the True Knots by using Abra's bait. Once the True Knot arrive at the scene of the trap, the Temptress tries to hypnotize Abra, but it turns out Abra is now Master Illusionist, and made them all think a teddy bear was actually her. The ambush is sprung, and the psychics of various abilities and power levels engage in a low RPM gunfight, in which the Temptress is the only surviving villain. She has an odd moment where she waxes philosophically about fucking men, and unfortunately, since Stephen King realized the story hasn't really cost our protagonist anything until this point, she manages to hypnotize Billy into killing himself. Tragic moment, made all the more tragic by the fact that Billy was barely a character at this point. Abra realizes that Crow Daddy was not at the firefight right as he sneaks up behind her and kidnaps her. Her father is dead as well. You know, the guy who spoke for a minute when Daddy showed up, just so there would be meaning behind his death? Yeah, that guy. As Crow Daddy and Abra drive towards the caravan, Daddy has a bit of a monologue that has real shades of classic King, with the laconic speech and realistic twang many have come to expect from his villains. For a brief moment, the movie feels like something worth watching, but this dissipates once Danny possesses Abra's body and psychically drives their van into a tree. We are immediately brought back down from the clouds of cinema to the bowels of Hollywood blockbuster. Abra watches Crow Daddy die in a scene that feels ripped right out of a Walking Dead video game, taking clear joy in his suffering. If there's one thing the modern screenwriter lacks, it's the emotional levity to treat their character as, well, a character, and not someone they're having a personal conversation with about their petty in-real-life grievances. Scenes like these always feel more like the writer talking than the character talking. And this scene makes Abra seem like, well, kind of an asshole.
I hope that hurts.
Abra walks away and encounters an apparition of Rose along the road, and smirks at her. She smirks at her, in a way you would smirk at a police officer after successfully tossing your weed. This one condescending smirk is picturesque of this entire movie's attitude on the subject, and perhaps Stephen King's opinion on Kubrick's interpretation. It is a smirk of someone who thinks they are better than you, knows better than you, and in fact, just did better than you. Not only does this movie debase and dilute its own origins throughout its own runtime, it comes at you in the very end with a shit-eating grin, while I sat there in a state of mild disappointment and ever-increasing rage. At this point, all of Rose's soldiers are dead, and she swears revenge on the smirking 11-year-olds. She consumes all the remaining shine they had stored, and it's implied that her powers have increased, though I'm not sure what that means to me when she had been getting her ass kicked the past 45 minutes. Danny meets up with Abra at the hotel, and since neither of them are too emotionally distraught after the death of the most important person in their lives, they prepare to face Rose and finish her, once and for all. And now, we arrive at the ending. And this is where I feel the movie totally jumps the shark, if it hadn't for you already. So after our heroes have defeated every member of the True Knot besides Rose, Danny decides that the place of their final battle must be the Overlook Hotel. Now the reasoning for this isn't exactly clear. It's basically just that fighting there might be equally dangerous for Rose as it is for them, though there's been absolutely no indication of that fact throughout the film. And in fact, Abra has beaten Rose the Hat at virtually every turn when it came to psychic abilities. I mean, by this point, what power does Abra not have? She has astral projected, she's used psychokinesis while astral projecting, she can auto-write, she can manipulate chalk from 1,500 miles away, she can track someone across the American heartland using a baseball glove they wore for a few hours. In fact, she doesn't even need anything physical because she tracked Danny just to track Danny. She has visions in her sleep and even had the mental capacity to lay a trap for Rose the Hat the very first time they met. Abra and Danny have consistently had the upper hand since the moment Abra sprung the trap on Rose, and it destroyed any sense of drama going into this finale. The destination is used as an excuse to essentially recreate the opening shots of The Shining, only at night. When we arrive, Danny decides to go on a near 10-minute tour through the Overlook Hotel, an overly lengthy romp of long shots and member berries from Kubrick's greater film. I became very annoyed at this point because I started to feel shortchanged. Rather than giving us a moment of awakening for Billy so that his death meant something, or rather than revel in King's original idea of The Shining and give the audience actual psychic battles with the True Knot, the director eschews it all to pay homage to the superior director by filleting our nostalgia with less than engaging similes of Kubrick's cinematic prose. It's the dullest part of the movie. Even though it's supposed to be building up to the final battle, it feels like everyone took a coffee break, the characters included. Hell, even the hotel was taking a coffee break until Danny showed up, since apparently it's his own personal haunted house. He even has a short conversation with his father on the nature of alcohol, and Danny manages to somewhat rectify his feelings on his father. But sadly, this bit of diamond in the rough is not enough, and it's cut short by the arrival of Rose the Jobber. Rose wanders the hotel before eventually stumbling into the foyer. At this point, Abra forces Rose into a psychic maze, and despite Rose's supposedly increased power, she doesn't even realize it's all in Danny's mind. She delivers some hammy dialogue to Abra about the only difference between you and me, and I nearly rolled out of my chair due to the rising cliche levels. Abra Naruto runs around 100 times Kaioken Rose the Hat, slicing at her legs with the psychic version of the knife that she'd used to kill Baseball Boy. After a time, Rose manages to catch Abra, only to realize, finally, that she was never in Abra's mind. She returns to reality and engages in fisticuffs with Danny, who is wielding an axe, because why the fuck not? I thought this movie was about psychics, but this is one of those moments where the movie can't decide if it wants to honor the old interpretation or the original version. And as such, we encounter a scenario fit for network television drama, rather than a supposedly long-awaited sequel to a cult classic. Rose overpowers Danny and mortally wounds him. She then moves in for the feast and begins to explore Danny's mind unrestrained, where she finds the boxes containing the ghosts of the Overlook Hotel. Danny has a tagline which I'm sure sounded really cool on paper, and he sicks the ghosts upon Rose, who consume her shining, though I have no clue why this would happen, and certainly Danny didn't know this would happen. You know what? Who gives a shit? Turns out Danny did have superpowers after all. His powers were ghosts, guns, and friendship. Unfortunately, unleashing the ghosts caused Danny to become possessed, so he and Abra can reenact Jack Nicholson chasing Shelley Duvall through the hotel. Only this time, Abra is there. Abra, the all-powerful Deus Ex child savant who just bested a small force of century-old killer psychic vampires. So in the end, Abra just stands there, in front of the axe, and tells Danny to be better. She literally debates the spirits of the hotel like she's on the podium at Berkeley, until Danny returns to his senses and decides he must sacrifice himself to save Abra. Forget that he was mortally wounded by the axe, because the scripture did. He isn't going to die after all, and supposedly has a choice in this matter. He overloads the boiler because tending the boiler was the primary job they mentioned in the opening scenes of The Shining, and Danny dies a pitiful death, ultimately unable to escape the horrors of the hotel that destroyed his family nearly 40 years prior. But I'm supposed to be happy, because Danny passed on his legacy to an 11-year-old savant who was always better than everyone else in the movie at everything. The cops and firefighters arrive in a nick of time, despite the hotel being 25 miles away from civilization, so actually seeing a fire in the dead of night would be relatively difficult. But let's forget that tidbit of Shining lore. Danny's spirit shows up and apologizes because he was telling Abra to hide her shine out of fear that maybe people she loved could be hurt. But in the end, I guess the death of her father wasn't a dramatic enough consequence for her to feel any regrets or suffer any long-term emotional scars like Danny did. Not only is she a better shiner as a child, she is more emotionally and mentally developed as well. She never really needed Danny to begin with. Danny tells Abra to shine on, like he's going to become the 5th member of the Beatles in heaven, and fucks off forever, because even though Abra is still a child, there's nothing more Danny can teach her. Abra comforts her mom by telling her that we go on after death, because God forbid this movie could leave you with a little emotional resonance. It's as though every scene of the end of the movie further serves to deflate the gravity of everything that came before it. In the final scene, Abra spots one of the ghosts from the Overlook in her bathroom, the same one that had scared Danny for so long and required Scatman Crothers to resurrect himself, so he could teach him how to build a trap box. She walks in with no prior knowledge of how the boxes worked or were even built, and successfully slays all over the ghost. Good going, Queen. Between the missed opportunities with the True Knots and Billy's character, and the over-reliance on Abra's plot armor to carry the film forward, I ended up with not enough of what I wanted and far too much of what I was already tired of to begin with. The movie sought to right the perceived wrongs Stephen King had seen in Kubrick's interpretation, but instead revels in it for most of the film. Rather than receiving a dramatic reimagining of the Shining lore, or a dedicated successor to Kubrick's piece, we are instead left with a Frankenstein film that fails to attract a fandom, old or new. And of course this is the case, since it satisfies nobody. Truthfully, I think the ending retroactively tainted the Dr. Sleep experience. The fundamental problems with this film arise from the fact that it was conceived, almost from the ground up, even in book form, to remove any trace of Kubrick from the cinematic interpretation of Danny the Shiner. While it features things like the Overlook Hotel, or Danny's battle with alcoholism, these mostly serve to push Danny away from the subtlety of The Shining as a sixth sense, and more towards the abrasive and silly idea of Shining as a superpower. From the beginning notes of the opening credits, taken directly from Kubrick's original piece, the movie can't help but try to overwhelm you with nostalgia bait, while doing a general disservice to the things it tries to bait you with. It's cape shit with a suspenseful flair, but it isn't even successful at being a cape film. At most, it's a disappointing romp through your old haunts with a few new friends. If you need a clear vision of the creative bankruptcy of this production, look no further than the fact that HBO had already optioned a prequel featuring Halloran, the old mentor, before this film ever came out. A Halloran prequel would be like a Mr. Miyagi prequel, gratuitous and unnecessary. In any case, that project has most likely been shelved. Between the disappointing box office returns on Dr. Sleep and the constant change of ownership of HBO Time Warner, nothing is certain anymore with Warner Bros. At least we got the Snyder Cut before it all went tits up. Even if it wasn't the best movie, it was an important moment in modern Hollywood history where the fans and the directors superseded the studio and the producers. I don't know who in the audience was asking for Dr. Sleep, besides Stephen King himself. And in the end, I don't think even King was fully satisfied, as the producers forced the inclusion of the Overlook Hotel. All around, I found Dr. Sleep to be an unsatisfying mess of incompatible energies, trying so hard to satisfy everyone, and in the end only disappointing itself. This is a film that wanted the cake and wanted to eat it. It wanted to surf the wave of the original film while removing almost entirely the things that made it so memorable, made it so iconic, made it so important. That's perhaps the biggest insult I could lay on Dr. Sleep in comparison to The Shining. The Shining is an important film in the lore and methodology of cinema, while Dr. Sleep will be remembered as a boring, by-the-books, television-grade cape film. And that's all I have to say about Dr. Sleep. Thank y'all for watching. Y'all have a great rest of your day. Share this with someone who also likes movies. And peace and love.